So you're thinking of starting your fantasy drafts with a wide receiver this season, but you're conflicted because you've also seen my videos proving that the numbers show having good running backs early in your draft improve your chances of winning your fantasy league. Well, in this video, I'm going to tell you how you can get the best of both of those worlds with 3 must-have running backs that you need to add in your fantasy draft. Headliner Nation, in today's video, I'm covering must-have running backs, and these are 3 guys that you could have a shot on early in your drafts, regardless of whatever strategy that you go with. But I keep getting the same question over and over. Kyle, I want to start with a wide receiver in the first round this year. What do I do after that? Well, all 3 of these running backs can be drafted after your first round, and on top of it, all have top 12 running back potential to help you dominate your league with the running backs that you need to go along with that dominant wide receiver. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and let's hop right in to Travis Etienne. That's right, Tank Bigsby truthers, here we go. Listen, I don't mind Tank Bigsby, and he's actually going to be the perfect complement to Travis Etienne, but in no way, shape, or form will he be taking Travis Etienne's job. The nice thing about these 2 is that they do things a lot better than what the other one does. So let's start with Travis Etienne and talk about what he's good at first. Last season, he finished 9th in the league in rushing yards, and he was tied for the 4th most 100-yard games on the season. He was 5th in yards per attempt, and he was also tied for 5th in red zone carries. Keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about that more in just a minute. But Travis Etienne's ability to snap off big plays is what's going to continue to leave him in the backfield. Last season, he had 26 runs of 10 or more yards, 16 runs of 15 or more yards, and 4 runs of 40 plus yards, which tied him for 1st in the league with Derrick Henry. His 451 rushing yards that came on those runs of 15 or more yards was good enough for 3rd most in the league. And he also had 52 runs for first downs, tying him for 10th among running backs. Travis Etienne's ability to take the ball from anywhere on the field and absolutely blow open a big play is unmatched by a lot of running backs at the NFL level. But when you take a look at some of his efficiency stats, those are good as well. He avoided 57 tackles last season, which was good enough for 0.26 avoided tackles per attempt. Both of those numbers put him in the top 5 of NFL running backs. So once again, his ability to make people miss and blow through holes is what led to a lot of big games for him. But I don't think people realize how good Travis Etienne was actually in the passing game last year. He was 10th in yards per target. He was 9th in yards per reception, and he was 6th in yards after the catch per reception. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of mouths to fill this year, but if for some reason you're worried about him losing touches on the ground to Tank Bigsby, well, he could add a little bit more work in the passing game, and if he maintains some of these numbers, he'll more than make up for that. But why don't we go ahead and do a little math and take a look at some of Travis Etienne's best weeks last season and what that could potentially translate to in 2023. Last season, Etienne became the starter in week 6, and from week 6 through 10, he was the RB3 on the season. Unfortunately, he had to leave week 12 early with a sprained foot, and then trying to come back in weeks 13 and 14, he was still dealing with that sprain and wasn't 100% yet. But then in weeks 15 through 17, when he had gotten over that, he hit big numbers for us again and ended up the season as the RB9 in that stretch. Now, even though he had a big week in week 17, he ended up leaving that game early and left week 18 early as well, as Jacksonville rested their starters. So if you take a look at Travis Etienne's 8 best weeks from last season, he scored 134 fantasy points in that time frame, or good for just over 16 points per game. And if you take those 16 points per game and spread them out over the course of 17 games in a season, that gives you just over 285 fantasy points, which if he were to achieve that, would have been good for the RB5 overall in 2022. Now let's go back to the point I made earlier about Travis Etienne being tied for for 5th in the league in red zone rushing attempts. On those red zone attempts, he only scored 4 rushing touchdowns, which was actually one of the worst conversion rates in all of football. And that is why Jacksonville added Tank Bigsby, because that is what he's going to be good at. When they get into the red zone or closer to the goal line, you will see Travis Etienne come off the field a little bit more and end up seeing Tank Bigsby get a few more of those carries. But Travis Etienne only had 5 total touchdowns last season. So if you're freaking out saying, but Tank Bigsby is going to take away those rushing opportunities near the goal line, well, the numbers that I just gave you a second ago, those numbers included only 5 total touchdowns last season. And with those numbers, he still showed it was capable of producing high enough total games to reach top 10 potential. And I'm sorry, but are we also forgetting the fact that your starting quarterback in Jacksonville was teammates with Travis Etienne? There is no way in the world that they're going to pull Travis Etienne off the field more for Tank Bigsby, knowing that him and Trevor Lawrence have so much chemistry together. When you get into that end of the second, beginning of the third, late third, early fourth round, you're going to be looking for running backs that can give you decent fantasy points, like RB2-ish average. But you also want to grab guys in that area that are going to give you RB1 upside on any given week. And that's why taking Travis Etienne somewhere in that ADP area is going to be good for you, because you're going to get solid RB2 numbers from him just based on his floor alone. Again, he will be the starter, but his upside and ability to rip off big plays is what gives you a chance at RB1 numbers. All right, let's move on to one of the guys that was a breakout for me last season based on my dynamic running back rating, which you can find in our draft guide. And if you haven't gotten our draft guide yet, right now is the perfect opportunity to get it for more than 50% off. And it's really easy to do. All you need to do is download the Underdog app to your phone, create a new account, and deposit at least $10 using code word headliners. Underdog is going to match that deposit up to $100, and you're going to get a free fantasy football draft guide from us. If you want to play against myself, Jake, Ethan, Mac, Taylor, anybody on the team, and some best ball tournaments this season, or even hit us up during the season for some pick'ems, you need to get on the Underdog app right now. And again, all you have to deposit is $10. And if you do that, our draft guide, which is typically $21.99, is coming to you for over 50% off. So make sure that you get signed up right now and make your deposit so you can get started with your fantasy research with one of the best draft guides in the industry, bar none. All right, but back to my boy Rhamondre here, because last season I absolutely loved. In fact, coming out of the draft that I loved him, but I didn't get a ton of people to hop on the bandwagon with me. Hopefully you're hopping on now. There's still a little bit of room left. Stevenson was 12th in the league last year in rushing yards, but he also showcased some of that big playability as well, with 30 runs of 10 or more yards and 16 runs of 15 or more yards. And he had 375 yards on runs of 15 or more yards, which was 8th best in the league. And all of that is great. Obviously, again, Rhamondre Stevenson, he was putting up yards, the volume was there, the dude had the ability to break off some big plays. But how was his efficiency? He averaged 4.96 yards per attempt last year, 7th best. But his 3.81 yards after contact per attempt was the 2nd most in the NFL. That was good for 801 yards after contact, the 6th most in the league. So we're on 2 different ends of the spectrum here with Travis Etienne and Rhamondre Stevenson. Travis Etienne makes more guys miss, while Rhamondre Stevenson just runs through more guys. But even for being a bruiser in the running game, Rhamondre Stevenson was one of the best receiving running backs in all of football last year. This guy was 3rd in targets, 4th in receptions, and 7th in receiving yards out of the backfield. He really, truly was an all-around running back last season. And one of the main reasons why I think this guy has top 5 potential here in 2023, if he continues to get some of that receiving volume, even if it is a little bit less, and we see his production on the ground get even better. Let's break out the calculator once again and break down last season and see what what it can translate to this year. And specifically, I want to look at the weeks in which Rhamondre Stevenson got 10 or more carries, because the biggest concern that people continue to share about him is that the Patriots backfield has always been a timeshare in the past. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking towards the future. We're not living there anymore. Rhamondre Stevenson had double-digit carries every week, weeks 3 through 11, and also finished as the RB6 during that time frame. Then in week 13, he had double-digit carries, but unfortunately fell to running back 22. And then in weeks 15 and 16, he was back to double-digit carries, but unfortunately didn't hit that ceiling either and was running back 19. Now, one thing I want you all to note from weeks 3 through 11, when he had all of those double-digit carry weeks, Damien Harris only missed 2 of those games, meaning that in a majority of those games, even with Damien Harris still on the roster, Rhamondre Stevenson was getting double-digit carries a week. And also last season, Stevenson only played in less than 60% of the offensive snaps 4 of the 17 weeks he played. Can you really look at the running backs currently in New England and say, that guy deserves to be on the field more than what Damien Harris was last year? And depending on when you're watching this, some of the free agent running backs left out there, maybe like Zeke Elliott, Dalvin Cook, Kareem Hunt, they were not signed by New England. And even if they added one of those guys, none of them are better than what Rhamondre Stevenson is, especially Zeke Elliott. Because even if Elliott were to sign, and again, he hadn't as of this recording, there's no way he's going to take more touches away from Stevenson than what Damien Harris did last year. The year prior, in 2021, Damien Harris ran for 15 rushing touchdowns, and then they handed the keys over to Rhamondre Stevenson in 2022. So let's take a look at the what-ifs once again. And if we look at the weeks above where he had double-digit carries, Stevenson scored 170 fantasy points in those 11 weeks, which was good for 15.5 fantasy points per game. Now, if he can stay healthy for 17 games in 2023 and average 15.5 points per game, that would come out to 263.9 fantasy points, which would have been good for RB6 in 2022. If you're still sitting out there worried about Rhamondre Stevenson and who's going to take touches away from him, you're living in the past. This is a different offense. This is a coaching staff that has grown, and they haven't had a running back like Rhamondre Stevenson in quite some time. Even if Rhamondre Stevenson doesn't hit the ceiling of RB6, he should still see plenty enough volume, and we know he's good enough efficiently to be able to come in as a low-end RB1. If I had to bank on any of the 3 guys in this video to finish inside the top 12 and have the highest ceiling, I would bank on Rhamondre Stevenson. He is by far my favorite in this area, and I cannot believe he's not being drafted earlier. Let's take a look at another running back in which a lot of people are fading just because of the guy that was drafted in 2022. And for me, it's going to be Kenneth Walker. I like Zach Charbonnet. I'm not nearly worried about him as a lot of you. I mean, Kenneth Walker on the ground last season showed us exactly what he is capable of. And it was a lot of the same things that he did at Michigan State his final year. He ran for over 1,000 yards. He had 5 games of 100 or more yards last season, which was tied for 4th. And he had 9 rushing touchdowns, which was tied for 9th. On top of that, his 29 runs of 10 or more yards was 10th best in the league. His 17 runs of 15 or more yards, which was tied for 3rd. And he was also tied for 3rd with 481 yards on runs that went 15 or more yards. Kenneth Walker showed that explosion more times than not last year. And just like our other 2 running backs in this video, he had a nose for the first down marker. And really, you had the best of both worlds with Kenneth Walker. We talked about it with Travis Etienne and his ability to make people miss. Rhamondre Stevenson and his ability to run through people. Kenneth Walker can do both. He was 14th in yards after contact per attempt and 13 in total yards after contact. Plus, he was 10th with 48 avoided tackles. And as of this recording, he is dealing with a growing injury, but that is 4 weeks out from the season. I anticipate him taking a little bit of a break and being just fine for week 1. One thing I want you to keep in mind, though, is Zach Charbonnet, especially if you mention, but Kyle, the Seahawks used a second second round pick on him. They may have drafted him number 52 overall with their second round pick, but the Seahawks also did not pick in the third round. In fact, when Seattle took him at 52 overall, they didn't have another pick until 108 overall. So even if the Seahawks had a third round grade on Charbonnet, moving a little bit early on him in the second round was an absolute must. That round right there doesn't necessarily mean that they think he's better than Kenneth Walker. If they really wanted to add a backup that they felt complemented Walker, they needed to do it then, because there's no way him or probably several other of the running backs they liked would have been available when it came back. So the argument that Charbonnet was a second round pick and that's why he's going to get so many touches, I'm throwing that out the window, because when you look at why he was picked in the second round, it doesn't necessarily mean that them or anybody else had a second round grade on him. But just like in fantasy football, if you like your guy, you go get him. You don't worry about the ADP or where you have somebody, especially if there's no way that he makes it back to you. And Charbonnet is the perfect complement for Kenneth Walker. I absolutely think that he's going to help him and do a lot of different things that maybe Walker doesn't do well, like maybe even help in the pass game a little bit. But there's no doubt about it, Kenneth Walker could still average 15 carries a game this season, and that is more than enough considering how his big playability came to fruition last year. And speaking of last year, let's take a look at how that went for him. Because in week 1, he was actually inactive, and then he didn't even become the starter until week 6. When he finally took over in week 6 and started getting a bulk of the workload all the way through week 12, this guy was the RB5. Then in week 13, he had to leave the game early, and in week 14, he missed the week. And then when he came back in weeks 15 through 18, still missed some of that upside we had seen earlier in the season, but he still came out as the RB19 during that time frame. So if you take a look at the 10 best weeks from last season, which I just talked about a second ago, he scored 147 fantasy points, or just over 14 fantasy points per game. If you take those 14.75 fantasy points and multiply them by 17 hopefully healthy games, that comes out to almost 251 total fantasy points, which would have been good for RB7 in 2022. Headliner Nation, this video was meant to do two things today. Number one, for those of you adamant about going wide receiver in round 1, I'm okay with it, I understand, but these are 3 options that you could pick 2 of when it comes back to you at the end of round 2 and the beginning of round 3 to really help stabilize your running backs when you have a stud wide receiver already there for you. Or number 2, if you use your first round pick on a running back and then decide to go wide receiver after that, then you can pick one of these guys, possibly 2 if they fall into the 4th round, to really solidify your running backs for the entire season. And while all 3 of these guys do have some things, including their backups, that could limit their upside in any given week, they all should stay the starters. They all have big playability. They all have the opportunity to be guys that could still finish inside the top 12 running backs on the year. And if you hate any of these guys, please keep an open mind and go back and watch this again if you're still not sold. Because once again, the numbers and the research show us that if these guys stay healthy this season, they're going to have fantastic years. Headliner Nation, hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new here to the channel, and make sure you leave me a comment down below and rank these guys in order of priority in which you want them. But I'm out of here, Headliner Nation. Appreciate you all tuning in. Peace out. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.